in the dim chapel of Marseille, the night before her wedding. A girl knelt alone before a flickering altar. The daughter of the Medici line was only 14, wrapped in Florentine silk that shimmered like candlelight. Outside, the sea whispered against the harbor walls, and the bells from distant towers drifted through the wind. Inside, her trembling hand moved across a piece of white cloth, with ink mixed from ash and wine. She wrote 2 words in Latin, small and deliberate. Memor ero, I will remember. It was not a prayer, it was a vow. She did not address God or her future husband, but something deeper, something that already knew the cost of being born into power. Each letter carried the weight of silence, the fear of a stranger's bed, the loneliness of a life already promised away. The air smelled of wax and salt. A drop of blood from her fingertip fell onto the cloth, spreading slowly across the words until the ink and blood became one color. In that stillness, she whispered a final sentence, one no priest would ever hear. She said that memory would be her crown, sharper than gold and heavier than sin. Her voice was soft but steady, a sound between prayer and defiance. Outside, a gust of wind extinguished the candle beside her. The flame hissed, and smoke curled upward like a thin veil. In that instant, it was as if the vow had been taken by the night itself, the same night that would follow her through the corridors of power, through poison and love, through the centuries that would remember her name. And as the bells of Paris begin to echo through time, another wedding awaits, one that will drown a kingdom in its own devotion. If you believe that every vow leaves a scar upon history, follow and subscribe to our channel, where the voices of the past still burn in silence. The morning of her wedding rose over the harbor of Marseille like a pageant of gold and promise. Banners moved with the wind, trumpets called from the ramparts, and crowds gathered to see the Italian girl who would become a French queen, Catherine de Medici, 14 years old, rode through the gates beneath a veil of silver lace. Her carriage was surrounded by guards and courtiers, their faces painted with smiles meant for politics, not joy. She was a gift from Florence to the French crown, the living seal of an alliance. Inside the palace, the air shimmered with incense and candle smoke. Walls gleamed with tapestries of saints and angels, their woven eyes staring down on her as if they knew what waited ahead. Catherine's heart fluttered between fear and wonder. She had been told her husband was young, noble, and destined for greatness. Henry, Duke of Orléans, was only 15. Handsome in the uncertain way of boys who have not yet learned to be men. When he looked at her during the vows, she thought she saw kindness. For one moment, she believed love might grow where duty had planted her. That night, the illusion vanished. Behind the gilded doors of the royal chambers, another ritual waited. One whispered about, but never written down. The nobles called it Ceremonia di Purificazione, the purification ceremony. It was a tradition reserved for foreign brides, invented to test and humiliate those who entered the French bloodline. Catherine entered the chamber dressed in layers of Florentine silk, her hands trembling as she held a small rosary. The room was filled with the heavy perfume of myrrh and melting wax. Behind the walls, hidden in narrow corridors, men watched through slits carved into the stone. Their laughter drifted softly through the prayers, cruel and amused. She whispered her blessings in Latin, each word breaking in her throat. The rosary cut into her skin until blood stained the lace of her gloves. Around her, the candles wept onto the marble floor. What began as a wedding night became a ceremony of submission, and the girl from Florence endured it in silence. When dawn came, the bells of Marseille rang in celebration. The city rejoiced for its new princess, unaware of what had been taken from her. Catherine stood on the balcony and faced the sea. The wind lifted her veil, and beneath it, her eyes no longer held the softness of youth. In that morning light, she understood what the court demanded of its women. Here, survival belonged not to hearts, but to those who could remember without mercy. When dawn came, her innocence was gone, but her memory had teeth. The years after her wedding turned Catherine into a quiet shadow within the court. She learned to smile without meaning it, to bow without trembling, to hide her thoughts behind lowered eyes. In silence, she studied everything. The laughter that once broke her now became a kind of lesson. She began to see how the French court survived not through love or faith, but through calculation. Henry had grown handsome and distant. His heart belonged to Diane de Poitiers, the woman who ruled him through beauty and intellect. Diane moved through the corridors like a pale ghost of perfection, her pearls gleaming even in candlelight. To the nobles, she was a goddess. To Catherine, she was a mirror showing everything she would never be. But envy soon cooled into observation. Catherine watched how power could live in a whisper, how obedience could be shaped by grace. Her chambers became her workshop. Behind the tapestries, she kept a small table of herbs and powders brought from Florence. There she found again the calm she had lost in Marseille. The air smelled of crushed belladonna and candle smoke. Her fingers no longer shook as she ground the dark leaves into dust. From her lessons with the Italian nuns, she knew that every cure could also become a weapon if the measure was right. At night, she wrote names in a green leather book hidden inside the wall. The names of those who had laughed, of those who had watched. She added notes beside them, small details that could one day matter. She was not driven by hatred, but by memory. And she fed that memory with patience. Years passed, and the court saw only a quiet queen who smiled and obeyed. They never noticed the stillness that had become her armor. Catherine had learned the oldest secret of survival. Waiting was power. Patience was control. In the glow of her single candle, she looked at her ink-stained hands and knew she no longer prayed for mercy or redemption. Her faith had changed its shape. She no longer needed prayers. She had formulas. When Henry became king, the court celebrated as if the world itself had been reborn. Trumpets echoed through Paris. Banners unfurled across the palace gates. And Catherine stood beside him in a crown that gleamed but weighed like iron. Diane de Poitiers remained close, still radiant, still whispering into the king's ear. She wore pearls while Catherine wore composure. The young queen learned that her presence was useful, but her thoughts were not. She became a figure of grace, arranging feasts, attending masses, smiling at every gesture of power that did not belong to her. Yet behind the marble walls, another kingdom existed, one built from silence and candlelight. In her private chamber, Catherine kept a small flame burning through the night. The sound of quills and glass filled the air as she worked alone. On her desk lay the green leather book she had carried for years, its pages thick with names and small observations. She recorded not emotions but details, the pattern of an illness, the color of a wine, the scent a man left behind. It was not hatred that guided her, but discipline. Slowly she began to test what she had learned. A petal soaked in water, a crumb of bread brushed with powder, a sip of wine sweetened beyond reason. Servants sometimes grew pale or feverish, then recovered, and Catherine adjusted her measures carefully. The ledger became both a diary and a laboratory. She was not reckless. She waited. And when the first noble died, it looked like chance. Whispers spread through the court about a sickness that moved quietly among them. Men who once mocked the Italian queen now avoided her eyes. A few months later, another noble fell, and again, a small parchment was found upon his table. Written in neat Latin were the words "Mini Noctem," meaning "I remember the night." No one knew what it meant. Some thought it a curse, others a confession. The king never suspected. Henry still lived in the light of Diane, blind to the storm that gathered in the shadows. Catherine remained dutiful in public, attending births and funerals, hosting foreign envoys with gentle smiles. But in the solitude of her chamber, she measured powders by the weight of her patience. Winter came to Paris, quiet and merciless. One night, Catherine stood by the window watching snow drift across the palace roofs. The candle behind her flickered in the glass, reflecting a face no longer young, no longer afraid. The flame went out, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and wax. In the dark, she felt nothing, only the steady breath of the woman she had become. The day Henry II died, the bells of Paris tolled with the slow rhythm of judgment. His jousting wound had turned to fever, and within days the body that had once carried the crown lay still beneath silk. Diane de Poitiers was banished from the court before the candles beside his bed had cooled. Catherine stood by the window of the Louvre, dressed in black, her face unreadable. For the first time, the power that had always belonged to others settled on her shoulders. France was hers to hold, and already it trembled. The kingdom was divided. Catholics and Huguenots tore at each other's throats. Cities burned, and preachers filled the air with vengeance. Catherine understood that peace could not be begged for. It had to be manufactured. She became regent, the mother of a boy too young to rule, and her name began to travel through corridors like a rumor. Some called her savior, others witch. She let them call her what they pleased. Fear, she had learned, was the only language men truly respected. In the council chambers of the Louvre, the air grew heavy with silence whenever she entered. Ministers spoke in cautious tones, aware that her patience could vanish faster than candlelight. She listened to them argue about taxes, about faith, about the balance of blood and prayer. And when their noise reached a breaking point, she would speak a single sentence. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and final. Orders were obeyed before they were fully understood. She ruled not through cruelty, but through precision. One evening, as the court debated yet another uprising, an old advisor dared to ask her how she maintained control in a land so fractured. Catherine turned her gaze toward him, her eyes pale as frost. She answered softly, as if revealing a secret to a child. She said she kept peace by letting no one sleep peacefully. The chamber fell silent. The flicker of torches reflected on polished armor, and not a soul dared to meet her eyes. Outside, the winter wind carried the smell of ash from distant towns. Catherine watched it from her window and thought of the years behind her, of how pain had taught her patience, and patience had given birth to power. She did not rule because she was merciless. She ruled because she understood suffering too well. She had lived it, tasted it, and knew how to use it. As the city sank into night, the Queen Mother closed the curtains and whispered to herself, Mercy is a seed that grows rebellion. Fear, once planted, endures. She had learned that mercy breeds rebellion. Fear lasts longer. The summer sun fell softly on Paris in the year 1572. The city was dressed in gold and white, alive with music and bells. Along the Seine, flowers floated beside painted boats, and the people spoke of peace as if war had never touched their streets. It was the wedding of Marguerite de Valois and Henri of Navarre, a union meant to heal the wounds between faiths. Fireworks blossomed above the rooftops, and from the balconies of the Louvre, the royal family watched as the sky turned red with celebration. Catherine stood apart from the laughter, her face lit by the glow of torches. Her smile was flawless, yet colder than the wind that passed over the river. She had seen too many promises dressed in silk to believe this one would last. Beneath the music and the feasts, the air trembled with suspicion. The nobles smiled for one another, but kept daggers close. The tension was like a pulse, faint but constant. When the attempt on Admiral Coligny failed, it was as if the veil of civility had been torn in half. Catherine felt it instantly. The fragile peace she had built began to crack, and behind those cracks she saw the same chaos that had always followed power. She knew that if she hesitated, everything she had protected would vanish. On the night of August 23rd, the decision came quietly. The moon hung low above the Seine, and the streets were black with waiting soldiers. Catherine looked out from her chamber window. She whispered the words that would echo through history. Sound the bells. The first toll rose through the air like a prayer turned inside out. Then another, and another, until every bell in Paris joined the chorus. The city awoke in terror. Torches flared, doors slammed, and the rhythm of feet on stone filled the narrow streets. Blood began to run where flower petals had fallen only days before. Brides and grooms who had danced at the royal wedding were struck down together. Priests and children vanished into the flood of violence. The river carried away the voices that tried to beg for mercy. From her balcony, Catherine watched the fires consume the city. The light touched her face and made it almost beautiful again. Beneath her breath, she spoke to no one. Paris remembers. By morning, the bells had grown quiet. The sun rose pale and cold over the ruins of celebration. Along the Seine, the water moved slowly, heavy with ash. A single bridal veil floated past the palace walls, white turning to gray as it sank beneath the current. The wedding of peace had become a requiem, and France would remember its silence long after the bells had stopped. The years faded like smoke over the rooftops of Paris, leaving Catherine alone in a palace that had grown colder than marble. The halls that once echoed with music now whispered only the sound of her steps. The sons she had raised with ambition were gone. The friends she had trusted turned to dust, and the city she had ruled through terror moved on without her. She spent her final winters surrounded by shadows and silence. In her chamber stood a small chest made of dark wood. Inside lay a piece of linen, yellowed by time, the same cloth she had written upon as a girl. The words were faint now. The ink mixed long ago with a drop of her own blood. Memor ero, I will remember. She traced the letters with her fingers, as if touching a wound that had never healed. Outside, France tried to forget. New kings rose, new wars began, and her name became legend and warning. They called her the Serpent Queen, the woman who ruled with poison and fear, the mother who had devoured her own peace. But in the stillness of her final nights, she prayed not to God, but to her own memory. She had ruled through fear, but she herself had never slept without it. One morning the servants entered her room and found the candles burned to their end. The window stood open, the air cold and unmoving. On the table before her lay the same linen cloth, unfolded beneath her hands. The ink had darkened again, as if time itself had answered her vow. Written in an unsteady hand were the final words, Memor ero. I remembered. Outside, the bells of Paris rang once more, softer now, almost kind. History would remember her as monstrous, but she knew the truth that no crown could erase. Monsters are born when memory survives what mercy cannot. If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to Out Channel, where history bleeds through silence.